Hey, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to another PS5 video. So there's been a lot of new PS5 game dumps that have recently appeared in the wild that we can now run on our jailbroken PS5s that we did not have access to previously. Talking about games, of course, like Biomutant and A Plague's Tale Requiem. We've got Stray, we've got the Resident Evil 7 and 8 Gold Editions, and many other games that are now runnable on jailbroken PS5s. So what I thought I would do in this video is just kind of go through the progress that has been made so far and what some of the limitations are right now, which is the reason why some games work and some games currently don't. So the reason why a lot of these new PS5 games have suddenly appeared that we can now run on our jailbroken PS5s is simply because, of course, we got the new self-decrypter from IdleSauce recently, which allows you to decrypt games on 5.x firmwares. It's also added support for 6.x and 7.x, but we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. So initially it was 5.x firmwares that were supported by this, and that allows you to decrypt the game executables by running the game with John Tornblum's elf loader running in the background, and then you can send the payload using SOCAT, and it will go ahead and dump the executables and decrypt them to a dumps folder on the data folder on the hard drive, which can then be copied out and merged with your original game dump, so it can then be turned into a working game backup. Now, the reason why these PS5 game dumps work on particularly 4.x firmwares at the moment, a lot of these games that are being dumped actually use version 4 of the SDK, which is the version of the SDK that is compatible with 4.x firmwares. So even though the game requires a 5.x firmware to run, which is why we've not been able to dump those games up until now, because the game only requires version 4 of the SDK, it is then runnable on 4.x firmwares without any real backporting that needs to take place. And that's why games like Stray and Biomutant here run without any issues on my 4.03 console. Now, just because it targets version 4 of the SDK doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work 100%, because of course the way that we load games through items flow, instead of from a fake package which doesn't exist for PS5 games, it's not really the way that games are designed to be loaded. So even a game that is targeting the correct SDK version for your firmware might still have some other issues to do with the game itself that prevent it from working. Now, there are some games that require version 5 of the SDK that are also working, like A Plague's Tale Requiem, which has recently been made available, and that can now run on my 4.03 system as well. The reason for that is that some of these games that use the version 5 of the SDK don't appear to actually use any of the new features from that new SDK version, so they'll still be able to run for the most part on a 4.x PS5. There's also been a downgrade script added by IdleSauce to the self-decrypter release, which can be used to patch the game executables to, I believe, just kind of change the target version to an older SDK version so that the console will allow the game to try and execute. However, of course, if the game actually utilizes a lot of new features in a higher SDK version that are not available in the older SDK version, then the game is simply not going to work without some kind of more intensive backporting process, which would require actually patching out things like function calls to features from the new SDK that don't exist in the old one, or replacing them with some equivalent feature in an older SDK to try and get it to work, and therefore they will just error or crash when trying to run them on a 4.x PS5. And that's why those games are currently not available yet. But I'm sure whatever's causing these backported games not to work at the moment will eventually be figured out in the future. So that is the reason why some games are available on 4.x firmwares and some simply are not right now. So as for the 5.x games that cannot run on 4.x firmwares right now, we'll just have to either wait until the backporting process is successful and the issues are figured out, or we just wait for, of course, K stuff to get ported over to 5.x firmwares, and then people on 5.x firmwares should be able to run those games. Now, moving on to 6.x and 7.x, this is where we run into some more significant issues here. So even though the self-decrypter does have support for 6.x and 7.x, we're not actually able to decrypt any games on those firmwares right now. And that appears to be because of some kind of additional security measures that were added from 6.0 and higher. At least that would seem to be the case right now. This warning has been added here to the self-decryptor, saying it seems that game decryption is not working on 7.xx and 6.xx is untested. We just can't decrypt the game executables in the first place on 6.0 to 7.61 right now, because when you attempt it, it will always error out, Now, I've spoken to IdleSauce about this. He seems to believe whatever has been changed has most likely been changed in 6.0 because of new security measures that were added in those firmwares, and therefore it results in the error when trying to dump the game. As you can see, me trying to dump Last of Us Part 1 on my 7.61 system, and the decryption is always failing, and I've tried multiple games, it's the same across the board. So that is the issue at the moment. So 6.0 to 7.61 games cannot be decrypted right now. I have only tested on 7.61 myself, so perhaps this change was actually implemented in a higher firmware than 6.0, and maybe it will work on some 6.x firmwares, but so far it looks like it's most likely 6.0 and up, where we cannot decrypt these games. So the general TLDR is that we can decrypt games up to 5.50 firmware and turn those into working game backups that can run on 4.x if their target SDK version is the version 4 of the SDK. And if it requires version 5 of the SDK or higher, then IdleSauce's downgrade script might be able to get some of those games working as well. Otherwise, we'll have to wait for manual backports to be created for the games that use a lot of the new features in those higher SDK versions. And of course, you would need somebody like CYB1K in order to do that. And I know he has been trying to manually backport some PS5 games with limited success, I believe, at the moment. And so we'll need a 5.x version of K stuff in order to be able to load those. And as for 6.x and 7.x, we're going to need some kind of overhaul to the whole self-decryptor to allow it to actually decrypt games on those higher firmwares. Now, some of these games might work on even older firmwares, but for the most part, it's 4.x firmwares that are getting support here. And if you are running into any issues trying to load these games, remember to try and load them from other storage devices as well, because sometimes certain games will not load from the internal storage and they'll have to be loaded from a USB or from the M.2 drive in order to get them to work. So anyway, I just wanted to give a general update on where we stand right now so far with these PS5 game backups and why we've seen a lot of new game backups appear in the wild recently. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video or found the information useful. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And once again, I'll hopefully see you guys in the next video.